So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and it allows you to have many different rules, many different style rules. And there are some times when those style rules come in conflict. So when two different style sheets or two different style rules set the same property for the same element, then which one wins? And there's a lot of ways to win. Specificity is a big part of it. The more specific the selector is, the more likely it is to win. And there's a specific rules about that, how that works. So you can identify specificity with 4 numbers separated by commas. The first number counts how many style attributes there are. Now, a style attribute is when the style is set in line, actually in the HTML tag. And that first number counts there. The second number refers to the ID selector. So if there is an ID in the selector, it gets counted here. If the third one, if there's a class selector, it gets counted here. If there's a pseudo class selector, that's like :hover, :active, those are class selectors. Those get counted here, and attribute selectors get counted here. The last number is the element selector. So if there's an element in the selector, it gets counted here, or a pseudo element, like : first line. So each part of the selector gets counted in one of these 4 categories, and they have priority. So the one on the left has the highest priority, and it wins over any number of the others. So if I have a 1 in the first one and a 12 in the second one, the 1 wins. Let's go through a few. So the asterisk is the universal selector, which selects all the elements. That's not specific. In fact, it's so not specific, it doesn't get counted at all. Here we have an inline style. So here we have an HTML tag h1, and the style attribute is being set color to this value. So it gets counted once. This is one style, inline style rule. And so it gets a 1 in that first number. H2, if this is the selector, this is an element selector, and it gets counted in the very last one. Here has 2 parts. So the selector says dot main content. And remember that the dot is a class. So it's identifying that some element has class set to main content. And inside that, a span. So the dot main content gets counted as a class. The span gets counted in the element selector. So the specificity is 0011. Here we can make it a little bit more specific. Notice this is exactly the same thing, but we've added a div here that says it's a div with class set to main content. We have 2 elements, the div and the span. We have 1 class, main content. So it's 0012. A side image, this means that it's an image inside an aside element. Both of these are elements. They each get counted in that last category. So this specificity of this selector is 0002. Here we just have a class selector, right? Only one thing to count, and it goes in that second number. So the specificity is 0010. This is an attribute selector, and so it gets counted in that second number. So that's where the attribute selector goes. This makes it a little bit more specific because it's saying a div with this attribute. So the attribute gets counted in this column, the div gets counted in the element number. This one we have a class, it gets counted in this category, and here : after, is a pseudo element, and it gets counted in that last number. So this specificity is 0011. Here we have A is an element, it gets counted in that last number. :hover is a pseudo class, so it gets counted in that second number. So the specificity of this entire selector is 0011. Here we have a div that contains a paragraph that contains a span, and it's the span that's going to get the style. And this is 1, 2, 3 elements. They all get counted in that last number. This makes it much more specific. This is div with class set to row, a p with ID set to fire, span with class set to warning. Let's count this. The div is 1 element, p is 2 elements, span is 3. So 1, 2, 3 elements. So 3 got counted in that last number. Classes, there's a dot row and a dot warning, so those get counted in the second number. So there's 2 classes. And then the ID gets counted in the third number. So the specificity of this entire selector is 0, 1, 2, 3. Now look at this carefully. This, you may look at this and say this is 3 elements, but what this is actually 3 different selectors on one style rule. Remember when we wanted to apply the same rule to multiple items, we simply separate with a comma. So this really is 3 selectors, and the div is 1 selector, and it's an element, it gets counted as 1. The second selector is just a p, that's 1 element, it gets counted as 1. The third selector is a span, and it gets counted as 1. So 3 different selectors, each of them with their own specificity of 0, 0, 0, 1. Okay, once you figure out what the specificity is, the leftmost wins. So here we have 4 in that last number, and that has less specificity than the 2 in the second number. And the 1 in the third number has even more specificity, and the 1 in that very first category, which is the inline style rule, has the most specificity. So if you look at these first 4, this one, the bottom one, has the highest specificity, and the 0004 has the lowest specificity. And over here you look at, we have a lot of mixed up numbers. Again, leftmost wins, so you look at the number on the left. That means the top one and the bottom one win based on the leftmost number. They have the leftmost number. Then you have to look at the other numbers to find out what comes next. They both have a 0 there, so they're tied to this point. And then lastly, you look at that last number, and the bottom one wins because it has more specificity in the last number and matching specificities in the previous one. So the leftmost always wins. Doesn't matter how large it is. But it only matters when there's a conflict. So if I have a variety of specificities, but this one's really changing the color of an element, this one's changing the background of an element, this one's changing the text align, and this one's changing padding, it makes no difference because they're not in conflict. They're changing different properties. So specificity is not even considered. There's no conflict. Another way to not have a conflict is if they're styling a different element. This one's styling a P element, this one's styling an image element, this one an H2, and this one an A. Then again, there's no conflict because they're setting style on different elements. So specificity only matters when it is the same element and the same style property. Important always wins. Exclamation important can be added to any style property value combination, and it always wins. It's not always a good idea to use it because it wins whenever it's applied and you might not expect it to happen. So you want to be very cautious and use this only as a last resort.